I'll briefly tell you what the situation is in France at the moment, as far as hijacking the secular agenda by the far right and the right was. As you may have seen in the newspapers, Marine Le Pen is now heading the National Front, and it is expected that she will have more than 50% votes in the next presidential elections, which are in a year and a half. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. The rise of the far right, the traditional far right, is there all over Europe. In Norway, Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, the far right has more than 50% voters. In Switzerland and Serbia, it's more than 30%. And France and Denmark are expected to have growing numbers of voters for the far right. So the problem is that these people are hijacking the agenda of defense of secularism, which is now conceived as a fence against Muslims, quote unquote, i.e. citizens of mostly North African descent from Muslim countries, and it's a tool for identity politics. But there are also new forces which are on the right of the far right, the traditional far right, and they are on the rise too. There's especially an organization called the Bloc Identitaire. Identity bloc or identitaire, does that mean anything? Okay, I'll just quote what they stated. It started in 2003, and it has now been joined by quite an important group called Riposte Laïque, secular riposte, which runs a website and has common actions with the Bloc Identitaire. And both also hijack the struggle for secularism and distort the meaning of secularism. For example, Muslim fundamentalists in Paris, in the heart of Paris, not in the suburbs, have been for 5 years now occupying streets for Friday prayers, and they put the police fences so that no car can get into it with a sign of no entry. And it has been going on for 5 years. The police doesn't do anything. So Bloc Identitaire and Riposte Laïque are now organizing picnics with, I quote, wine and pork in the same streets. So they are really looking for physical confrontation. And let me just quote something that the Bloc Identitaire said about itself. In the issue number 1 of ID magazine, Why We Are Identitaire, it states that French Revolution broke, I quote, cultural communities based on regional identity and genetic identity. And again, I quote, the dominant ideology pretends that identity is exclusively a personal choice. We contest this dogma. In their provocative actions and common actions, there's also the defense in court of a woman who ran a guest house and threw out of her guest house 2 veiled women because she didn't want them to be veiled in the common spaces of the guest house, which is perfectly illegal. The woman was condemned, but these groups paid for lawyers, paid for publicity in the newspapers, etc. So I think it's important for us to realize that when secularism becomes part of the official agenda of the National Front and of further right forces, we are having a problem to continue defend secularism and not be used by these people. The state goes exactly along the same lines, and Sarkozy is revising the very definition of secularism in which, may I remind you, stems from the 1905-1906 laws, in which it is stated that the state declares itself incompetent in religious matters. It's not just separation, it's more than separation, and will in no case, no instance, finance religious whatever operations. There is pressure on France to abandon, pressure by Europe to abandon this definition of secularism and move towards equal tolerance by the state of different religions, which is what you have in Britain. As you know, Sarkozy has been financing, creating out of the blue, top to bottom, the French Council of Muslims in France, and also setting up a Minister of National Identity, which seeks to define identity. As a consequence, 42% of the French people now considers Muslims, quote unquote, as a threat to their identity, I also quote, and 2/3 of voters on the right considers Muslims as a peril. He's now financing places of worship, etc. Let me just quote him two recent statements. When he visited the Pope, Sarkozy said, "The school teacher will never be able to replace the priest." That's the discours of Latran. And he also stated, "The secular republic gets into an ongoing dialogue with religions that are practiced on its soil so as to listen to them." It's a far cry from separation and incompetence of the state and not financing religions.
I'm going to speak slightly more abstract terms than the two previous speakers. I mean, I think it goes without saying, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time, if any, establishing the fact that some of the groups mentioned in the sort of blurb and run-up to this event, the EDL, the BNP, SIOE, Stop Islamification of Europe, are out-and-out racist organizations, and I think we can probably start by sort of working from that premise. And building on the fact that these groups have tried to confer upon themselves a veneer of respectability and to confer upon themselves the veneer of legitimacy by claiming that their politics is about something much more sophisticated, something much more progressive, i.e. fighting against Islamism, which I think everyone, again, in the room would recognize as a threat to the normative values of our society, to our security, and to the sort of future direction in which we wish to head as a country. And in that respect, we really have to begin to see increasingly these organizations that do operate on the far right and that do try to present themselves as legitimate partners in this fight as being the flip side of the same problem that we are ultimately seeking to defeat in Islamism itself. We see groups such as MPAC condemned by parliamentary reports and condemned by everyone who knows what they're about as being a deeply anti-Semitic and racist organization who attempt to do the exact same thing for themselves by claiming that they're not anti-Semitic but that they're anti-Zionist, and to try and say we have a legitimate political disagreement, we disagree on a matter of policy rather than actually expressing what they truly believe and what they truly stand for in that sense. So these two problems are essentially flip sides of the same coin, but they come from the same sense of hatred and prejudice and discrimination and bigotry, and certainly that underlies their political and philosophical worldview. Look, that view has flourished in the far right in particular to an extent in recent times, and it's been able to do that partly because of the wider social and economic factors that we might all look at. But of course, there has been a failure and a lack of desire and inability and inertia of the political class to also directly confront Islamism and to be willing and wanting to challenge it and directly go for it. And unfortunately, as a result of that, to some extent, the proponents of the anti-Islamist cause who come at it from the far right have been able to mainstream their arguments and their side of the debate in a way that is quite unpalatable and that is quite problematic, and it requires and it deserves our attention and our concern, and I think this event is largely a manifestation of that. To my mind, at least, the overriding philosophical sort of, I suppose, maxim of what is happening with these sort of organizations is the idea that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And they've been able to utilize that in order to move their side of the debate much further than we could really ever expect to. And to say this is not to go into the terrain of Saeed Awasi's recent comments and her dinner party test, which I reject and which I disagree with. But I think ultimately where she's coming from is sort of misunderstanding this problem. There is an issue here which is broader than what is happening in this country. Just as Islamism operates and feeds off a wider international climate and it's bouncing off that and responding to that, so too is the far right. You saw the debate, no one in this room will have missed it, that surrounded the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in America, which is neither at Ground Zero nor is it a mosque, but through the sort of propagation by far right people there, Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, this debate was mainstreamed in a quite remarkable and disturbing way, to the point where people like Newt Gingrich are saying no mosque at Ground Zero until there are churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia. To what standard does that hold American Muslim citizens in his own backyard? To what extent does he want to hold America to comparable moral standards as Saudi? This is not the way for the debate to proceed. So I think in that sense, that's all I really wanted to say, that this is a domestic problem. It has a large international component, has a component that needs to be tackled, and ultimately it needs to be seen as being a different manifestation of the same problem coming from the same basis. And in that sense, we need to tackle this collectively on the basis of shared values and tackle it on that basis, because ultimately what is it that we're fighting for? What is it that we're looking to protect and preserve? And none of these people, whether they come from the Islamist tradition or the far-right tradition, would share that with any of us.